This continues to show the idea that, like, slavery, I don't know why that won't go away. So it shows that slavery, what's the word that we called? We said, like, slavery does something. Yeah, yep. Slavery dehumanizes even slave owners. Okay. I want that to go away. There we go. Okay. All right, so again, which motif? So what do we find out in this second paragraph? So if this was all about her being nice and all the things that she did for him, what was, so notice like this idea of like her face was made of heavenly smiles. So he's explaining or describing her as being angelic, right? So then what happens here? But, so notice that but is a switch, right? So what happens in that second paragraph? So it shows a change. Again, which motif is Douglas continuing to use as before? Again, I think it goes back to number 2 over there. Why is it effective to hold off these phrases until the end of the 4-part noun phrase or the 3-part clause parallel? So where do you see these noun phrases and the parallel phrases? So you see made of all sweet accord, changed to one harsh, horrid discord, angelic face gave place to that of a demon. So notice that we look at the semicolon there. And then also, we look at that cheerful eye under the influence of slavery, soon became red with rage. So there's another semicolon there. So this is a stark contrast to so those two things are a stark contrast to each other. What did we say about headphones and phones?
Put them away.
Put them away, please. I don't even want to see them on your desk. Laura, you can leave yours out because you're going to be my definition person. All right, here we go. So we're starting in line 21. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on, and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. Remember what we read yesterday, right? Like we read that idea yesterday that Douglas's idea was that education would ultimately lead to his freedom. And here is what we're seeing, kind of this idea to counter that, right? To use his own words further, he said, if you give an N an inch, he will take an L. So notice that this is up there. An N should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best N in the world. So it's like education would equal the end of, what would we say? Like the end of
slavery?
No.
End of the enslavement of their mind.
Yeah. Now, said he, if you teach that end, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. So, like, he's almost, like, Auld puts it as like a disservice, like, oh no, you're going to ruin him, like not only for us, but you're going to ruin him because he'll never be able to be a slave ever again, and that's terrible for him. It would forever be unfit for him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Why would somebody be discontented and unhappy? Yeah, because now they understand that life. They understand what they don't have. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things, with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. So this is kind of like the key question he's asked since being like a child. I now understand what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom, which was what? Yep. All right, so stop. Removing the immortality is the prohibition to teach slaves literacy, a logical argument, and action. Okay, so taking away the idea that it's immoral to not allow somebody an education, to learn about the world and about themselves. So take that away, okay? And yes, we'll say that it is a terrible thing that has happened, but is the idea of not teaching slaves how to read and write a logical argument for what they want to achieve?
It's for what they want to be known about.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it is logical, right? What does this say about slavery? So let's see, there's one question there. There's two questions there, three. So one, yes, it's logical. Because if you remove education, then they don't have any desires because they don't know what else is out there. They don't know, right? They don't know. They're happy. I mean, not happy, but they don't know what they're missing out. What does this say about slavery? Yeah. And then question number 3, I'll put down here. What does it say about literacy? Like being able to read and write? Yeah, it's fundamental. It's a fundamental, I would say, skill, but it's a fundamental right. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at a time when I the least expected it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which, by the merest accident, I had gained from my master. So what is he saying? Like, I've learned so much from my mistress, but right then I learned more from my master, right? So at that point, learn more from Mr. Auld than Miss. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn how to read. I think we've kind of already answered that, right? I think we've answered that one over there. And I'd say that's 1, 2, and 3. The very decided manner with which he spoke and strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me instruction served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. So what is he saying? What about that? What about the way that Mr. Auld spoke to Mrs. Auld convinced Douglas? Listen to what he says. The very decided manner with which he spoke and strove to impress his wife with the evil consequences of giving me instruction served to convince me that he was deeply sensible of the truths he was uttering. So this man was crazy and mean and terrible. So what made Douglas go, he's right?
Being self-aware, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, like, they were both self-aware, so.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and I think it's the idea that he is this upset about this idea of teaching me how to read that it's got to be serious, right? Like, if he's that concerned about it, then it's got to have some kind of effect. If he is that worried about me learning how to read, then there's got to be some effect to it, right? It gave me the best assurance that I might rely with the utmost confidence on the results which, he said, would flow from teaching me to read. So he just had to, so Douglas had to trust the idea that learning to read would lead to freedom. It gave me the best assurance that I might rely with the utmost confidence on the results which, he said, would flow from teaching me to read. What he most dreaded, that I most desired. Oh. There's an antithesis. What he most loved, I most hated. That which to him was a great evil, to be carefully shunned, was to me a great good, to be diligently sought. So notice what we're doing is we're going like positive and negatives here, right? He most dreaded negative. Whatever was negative to him was positive to Douglas. Whatever he most loved, which was negative really to Douglas, right, was positive to Auld. I most hated. That which to him was a great evil, negative, to me was a great good. And the argument which he so warmly urged against my learning to read only served to inspire me with a desire and determination to learn. In learning to read, I owe almost as much to bitter opposition of my master as to the kindly aid of my mistress. So really, it's quite ironic, right? That one man that Douglas hated the most, ultimately gave him, motivation to read. So remember we said antithesis is like the mirror opposites of each other, right? Okay, so why do these examples of antithesis reveal about the relationship between a hardship and one's response to difficulty? So notice the situation that Frederick Douglass is in at that moment is really opposite of where he thought he would be. Ultimately thanking Mr. Auld for driving him to learn how to read. That's ironic. That is, the structure of an antithesis is ironic in the fact that it's opposites of each other, right? So how do those show the relationship between a hardship and one's response to difficulty? What is it? That is the biggest hardship that Frederick Douglass ever had. So what's the relationship between like coming up against an obstacle and how you respond to difficulty? Douglas was given an obstacle, and how did he respond? Yeah. Yep. I had resided but a short time in Baltimore before I observed a marked difference in the treatment of slaves. Okay, so where is Baltimore? So we're talking in the north. I had resided but a short time in Baltimore before I observed a marked difference in the treatment of slaves from that which I had witnessed in the country. A city slave, now we're talking about categories of slaves, is almost a free man compared with the slave on the plantation. He, which one is the he?
Field slave?
No,
City slave.
city slave. He is much better fed and clothed and enjoys privileges altogether unknown to the slave on the plantation. So even a slave in the north would be considered free by slaves in the South, just by the way that they are treated. There is a vestige of decency, a sense of shame that does much to curb and check those outbreaks of atrocious cruelty so commonly enacted upon the plantation. Okay, so where on the plantation, where is the shame given to? To whom?
The slave.
To the slaves. Where in the north, shame is given to whom? Slave owners, whites, who mistreat their slaves, right? So this is a stark contrast. So in the South, the slaves are shamed. And then in the North, the slave owners are shamed if they mistreat their slave. He is a desperate slaveholder. Who's the he here? Which slave owner?
All?
No, he's talking generally here.
Oh. The cities?
Well, they're all white.
The slave owner in the north.
Yeah. Yeah, a city slave owner. So this is a slave in the north. So he is a desperate slave owner who will shock the humanity of his non-slave holding neighbors with the cries of his lacerated slaves. So where in the South, from plantation to plantation, you can hear slaves screaming and crying, right, from being whipped. Where in the North, if you hear that on the plantation or the farm next to you, you are appalled, right? Few are willing to incur the odium attaching the reputation of being a cruel master. So in the South, people are kind of proud of that, right? That they're seen as being cruel, they're feared. And above all things, they would not be known as not giving a slave enough to eat. So again, that's the difference between the North and South. Every city slaveholder is anxious to have it known of him that he feeds his slaves well. So it's almost like a bragging rights for the slave owners in the North. And it is due to them to say that most of them do give their slaves enough to eat. There are, however, some painful exceptions to this rule. Directly opposite to us on Philpott Street lived Mr. Thomas Hamilton. He owned 2 slaves. Their names were Henrietta and Mary. Henrietta was about 22 years of age. Mary was about 14. And of all the mangled and emaciated creatures I've ever looked upon, these 2 were the most so. His heart must be harder than stone, that could look upon these unmoved. The head, neck, and shoulders of Mary were literally cut to pieces. I have frequently felt her head and found it nearly covered with festering sores caused by the lash of her cruel mistress. I do not know that her master ever whipped her, but I have been an eyewitness to the cruelty of Mrs. Hamilton. I used to be in Mr. Hamilton's house nearly every day. Mrs. Hamilton used to sit in a large chair in the middle of the room with a heavy cow skin always by her side, and scarce an hour passed during the day but was marked by the blood of one of those slaves. The girls seldom passed her without saying, "Move faster, you black gip," at the same time giving them a blow with the cowskin over the head or shoulders, often drawing the blood. She would then say, "Take that, you black gip," continuing, "If you don't move faster, I'll move you." Added to the cruel lashings to which these slaves were subjected, they were kept nearly half starved. They seldom knew what it was to eat a full meal. I have seen Mary contending with the pigs for the offal thrown into the street. So this is like food for the pigs. So much was Mary kicked and cut to pieces that she was often called pecked than by her name. So this is all like the exception. So let's talk. What is worse, do you think? Being a slave in the South and being beaten. I mean, we'll say it's all bad. I mean, we'll agree to that. But let's say in the South, being a slave and being beaten and seeing everybody beaten the same way. Or being these two in the North and seeing slaves well-fed, well-dressed, well-treated, and you being the outlier, like the difference. Which one is worse? Being in a community of everybody beaten, all the same, like with all the same evilness and all the same harshness, or being the two in the North in this community that are treated differently than everybody else?
All the same. So north would be a lot worse
Why?
because you get harsher punishments and you aren't treated the same as what you should have been treated for what you think, I guess. And in the South, it's just like equal amongst all things.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like the South, like they don't know any better, right? I mean, they know that there's better up there, but they don't see it, right? Where in the North, you see people being treated better than you.
It's like there's a broad spectrum. Like compared to like one just color, there's like a broad spectrum in the North.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is. Yeah, there is. Much so. Where there's not a whole lot of difference in the South. Majority of people in the South own slaves, right? All right, do this for me. Can y'all get out your computers for me real quick and see if the internet's working where y'all can log on? And then if y'all will take out your chapter 3 annotations page for me and put your name on it. I need one more grade. 3?
Chapter 5. Chapter 3.
I just said chapter 3. Does y'all's computer work? Let me see if mine does. It is? Okay, so open up to today's PowerPoint for me, please. And then if you'll go to the very last slide, it has a link to, I think, like 4 articles, right?